I'm excited to be welcoming Jimmy Daly of Superpath. Jimmy is someone I've respected for a long time, formerly of Animalz. He wrote one of my favorite blog posts on your blog should be a library, not a
publication.
A blog? What was this? Publication. Yeah. Sorry. And that theme is something we've stuck with for a long time. And Jimmy was so kind to have me on the amazing Superpath podcast, which I recommend for all of our listeners. And I thought it was only appropriate to bring him back on here as well. So welcome, Jimmy.
Yeah, thanks, Ross. Yeah, tables have turned. Now you can grill me about content stuff.
Yeah, so for the few people who might not know Superpath, you have an amazing content community there that I'm a part of. Highly recommended, especially if you're on the SaaS side of the house. But how would you describe what you do at Superpath and the many kind of value adds you have there?
Yeah, for sure. Superpath, I like to think, is the best community out there for content marketers. There's a lot of them in there. We've got 21,000-ish people in the community these days, although it is now split between free and paid. There's a few different parts of the business. There's the community and all that goes with it. So there's, some networking events, some exclusive content for paid members. There's a job board. There's kind of all these things that happen within the community world. And then we also run a marketplace, which, as we were just chatting about before we recorded, we're thinking of rebranding because it's a little confusing to say the Superpath marketplace when the name, I think, now is so associated with the community. Anyways, it's kind of going down a rabbit hole, but the marketplace, what we do there is we match up freelance content marketers with companies who want fractional content marketing help. So that's it in a nutshell. Been at it for 4.5-ish years or so. And it's been a journey. It's been good.
Nice. Yeah. Probably a little bit of a relief to get out of the agency world.
Kind of, maybe. The thing that's nice about an agency is that if you're a content marketer, you spend your day with a bunch of other content marketers. And that's really nice. Like having worked at SaaS companies previously where I was a team of one or part of a small team, to just be surrounded by a bunch of people who are thinking about content marketing all day, I really enjoyed. I left Animalz in May 2020, started Superpath June 2020, and that was really tough timing to go out and start working alone, and actually I feel like it took me a while to kind of recover from that. It was like having a team remote, right? But having a team of people to chat with every day. And then it's like, 2020 is like social life is very limited. Now I have no coworkers, like, oh my God. So anyways, I do miss the agency days sometimes for sure.
Makes sense. The grass is always greener, as they say. No matter what. Yeah, I mean, I love running an agency. It has its ups and downs, of course, but that makes total sense. And I highly recommend, your podcast. It's you're talking to a lot of great in-house and occasionally people like myself on the content side. And I thought that was a great kind of thematic way to tee up this interview. Is you've talked to a ton of really smart content marketers at these SaaS companies and sometimes agencies, as discussed. And there's maybe some themes across these companies that you could speak to and from your own experience as well. So like starting there, I'm sure people are curious what high performance looks like. Is there any kind of thematic commonalities you're seeing across these companies that might be interesting to people?
Yeah, that's a great question. The thing that comes to mind is that among all the best content marketers I know, and to define best, I mean the ones that are really performing, driving like real business to the companies that they work for, is that they have a very nuanced understanding of the product they're selling and the people they're selling it to. So like just to give an example, I had a guy on the podcast the other day named Ray Mina. He's the VP of marketing at a company called Fresh Paint. And this sort of became the theme of that conversation because I was sort of asking him like, what's your playbook? And he was like, I don't have a playbook. If I have a playbook, that means I'm basically saying I'm smarter than this challenge. But really, he spent, 6 months really understanding the product, which is in their case, like fairly complicated, really understanding the buyer, which is, again, like in their case, like long sales cycle, lots of people involved, like really understanding that process before he started to put together a content team and then a content strategy. But what he described, I felt was very consistent with some of the other really high performing content marketers I know, that like they don't come in with an opinion, they come in very open-minded. And then the better they get to know the product and the customer, the better job they can do getting the right content out there.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. And I agree. I mean, there's so much degrees of you could go completely off route with content that can do absolutely nothing for you potentially, and vice versa. That's something that could be super resonant for maybe not that much effort, simply beyond, of course, the effort is getting to know the product. And when you know the product, suddenly you can sometimes put out that content in like 2 hours, but it really was a 6 months of work.
Absolutely. And there,
it seems
you can be a high performing content marketer, I think, and check some of the foundational boxes. Like you got some case studies, got some middle funnel content, you got a little bit of awareness stuff out there, but like to really go like next level, I think you really have to like have a good relationship with the sales team, understand what their challenges are. Same with the customer success team or customer support, like understanding all the things that are happening with current customers, and like that kind of well-roundedness, I think, is what makes for the real high performers.
Yeah, I know you're not at Fresh Paint, so maybe we could dig this up after. I have the feeling you don't have an answer for this, but I am curious, was that depth the kind of interesting aha there, are there specific, maybe just even broadly, content examples that made that clear to you?
Yeah,
that they were powerful.
Yeah, there was one in particular that he mentioned that really resonated, which was that they're like a customer data platform that's HIPAA compliant, and so they sell into like large hospital chains and things like that. And they were going hard on the product marketing type content for a while, but one thing he realized after meeting customers and talking to them is actually one of the main things that they're concerned about is compliance. And so they've started running a kind of like a regular series where they are monitoring for any new regulations that would affect their customers. And then they very quickly get content out on that. So they'll bring in a lawyer who will help them understand the new regulations and then turn that into content in the form of articles, social stuff, and webinars to make sure that their customers and prospective customers are like totally in tune. And he described it as something he didn't like anticipate being vitally important, but as he understood the customer better, came to realize it was like one of the things that was really top of mind for them, which I found to be kind of interesting.
Yeah, that's a great example. Agree. Like if you just were not thinking if you're thinking in your traditional box, there's no way you probably come to that conclusion in a simple way. And those are like, in my SEO mind, probably ranking for a lot of those things are relatively easy if you get out of the gate, because it's always everybody in the keyword tools that you're most competitive against.
Absolutely.
Not the actual audience knowledge.
Yeah. Absolutely. Ray had, one other interesting thing about chatting with this guy, Ray, is that he's not a content marketer. He's a VP of marketing, and content is one of his levers. And it was just interesting to hear him talk about it, because sometimes I find, like, we talk to a lot of content leads on the podcast, and they, not always, but sometimes, they're very focused on the craft of it, whereas the VP or the CMO is thinking a little differently about content. So it's good to have a balance, I think, like, at least from my perspective. I like to hear what both parties have to say. And as I think about some of the, like, there's a couple of people we've had on the podcast that were kind of content managers or heads of content who are now directors of marketing and VPs. And like, that's kind of the journey they've been through. It's like understanding the broader picture, understanding the customer better. Some of these things that like sort of sound like obvious, but are actually like incredibly important for your own career too.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's a hard balance, right? Where you want to get results, or very often you feel like you need to get results. And sometimes they say, maybe if you're CMO, it's more urgent to do something in 90 days, that kind of thing. As a content manager, if you waited 6 months and did nothing, that might not be the best. And definitely as us as an agency, we have tension around even 1 month of onboarding, which is better than nothing, but is still not ideal, to your point on some of this stuff.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I certainly remember in the agency days, like looking for like what is the earliest possible signal we could find that this is working, like we can't just say, oh, just keep paying us for 6 months, we'll figure it out. There's usually something,
Yeah. Agree. Yeah. And more for us, that's as our industry is more mature, it's just updating content. You just quickly update content. You can at least signal you did something positive.
I like that.
And yeah, it's mature enough that you can do that.
Yeah, I like that.
You talked about that kind of idea and strategy. How about the question you ask people around certain types of content that tend to outperform from a results standpoint? Is there any themes there or standout answers you've received that people might find interesting?
Every now and then someone will say, we sort of created this blog post on a whim. We didn't think it would do much, and now it's like, it drives, it's like insane amount of traffic. That's like every now and then. The way that most people answer that question is that the thing that's performing best for them is usually a thing that they poured a lot of time and energy into. And it's usually some type of like original research, data they've pulled from their own product, a survey that they ran, or, like something that's becomes sort of like atomic unit of content on its own, but then kind of fuels, like you can pull the insights from the data into like thought leadership content or, your social posts and things like that. So it's like, but I find it interesting because if I'd asked that question 3-4 years ago, people might have said like, oh, we did this ultimate guide to X and it just crushes. And now people think about it like, well, we put this huge effort into creating this original research. And then now we have this thing that we can kind of always be referencing. We pull it into, there's some data in there that the sales team uses. There's some data in there that the social team uses and things like that. It's just interesting how the thinking around that has switched. But most people go to that as like a content effort that has performed better than expected.
That's interesting because it's literally exactly what we're doing now, where our mindset has shifted there. And we're calling it product-led digital PR, where you just kind of like do original research and then you reference it everywhere.
Yeah.
Like we weren't referencing it everywhere before. So that's interesting. And you also made me realize, like, thankfully, you just don't hear that 2-word phrase "ultimate guide" as often.
No, you don't hear that much anymore.
Because everyone knows that's not the best. Hopefully.
Yeah. But every now and then, like, something old becomes new again. Like who knows? Maybe we have this conversation in a few years. Like that's the thing again.
Yeah, that's true. It makes me think that Google's getting better about short form content. Like that skyscraper idea is just seemingly less performative. So I wonder if that's part of it. But it was always a tacky phrase, right?
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
Hard to truly have that be accurate.
Totally.
As well.
Totally.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting. Like, at the start of the conversation, you referenced this blog post I wrote 7 years ago about like your blog is a library, not a publication. And like, if you looked at the analytics of that, it's like really not very impressive. It's not like 100,000 people have read that article. It's far, far less than that. But the impact of it has been really interesting. Like it sort of followed me around. Like when I meet new people, they're like, oh, I read that article, and nice. I didn't expect that it would be a thing that would, that I would become associated with in the way that it sort of happened. Anyways, I feel like there's like that opportunity out there for companies as well. You know what I mean? The challenge of a post like that is sort of the exact opposite of the ultimate guide challenge. It's like to have not just data to speak to, but like an original idea or a concept, or a theory that you can sort of work through. Anyways, that's kind of its own rabbit hole too, but it's like, that's an opportunity that I wish more people were talking about in the content space, that, okay, we can collect data. Now we have something objective to talk about, but the subjective component of it, I feel, is still pretty underutilized.
Unharvested. Yeah. Makes sense. Maybe this goes to just that 6-month depth you spoke to. It's I don't know if you found this at Animalz at all, but it's hard to processize that idea, which inherently is probably why that will always be more powerful in a lot of ways, because it's true, like subject matter expertise and product depth and those kinds of things. But I think about that as an agency owner, and I'm like, how could I bring that from our team to our clients. And I feel like that would be very difficult, but that doesn't mean it's not the right answer. It's just curious if you have any thoughts on those kinds of things.
Yeah. Well, when I think back at like the Animalz time, like the way I sort of felt that the way that we created content for ourselves was perfect. And what I mean by that is one person, me, did sales and wrote all the content. And so it didn't have to scale because it's an agency. So your volume requirements are relatively low in terms of like how much content you got to get out, how many leads you're hoping to generate from it, things like that. But you always have this perfect alignment between the things you're hearing from your prospective customers and then the marketing you're putting out for those same exact people. And I thought that could scale, and it doesn't scale very well. Like certainly a lot of companies have figured this out in different ways. It's like the marketing team gets access to Gong, or things like that, which is nice. Yeah. It's way, way better than the pre-Gong days. But if you can find the way to kind of create that feedback circle so that the people you talk to are then, having this direct input on the stuff that you use to market to them, that unlocks a lot, and like we didn't really get into SEO for ourselves, at least when I was at Animalz, because we didn't need to. There was just such a rich trove of material for us to work with based solely on those sales calls.
Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, I loved your guys' blog. I think many people did. One of my initial transparent conversations I had in my head was, some of these things can be said, but can they be operationalized into the team's delivery as easily? Like, it's thought leadership on the agency side is difficult because often you'll say something, and I found this myself when I've said something, like I'll say something, but then obviously it needs to transmit to delivery, that ends up being not so great. So I don't know if you felt like that went pretty well, or maybe it's, I'm sure, mixed bag.
Mixed bag for sure. For sure.
Yeah, makes sense. But yeah, I mean, I love the approach, especially for a SaaS company. I mean, you don't have that scalability issue, right?
Yeah.
Or maybe pure consultative work. Content to a degree is kind of, obviously you got to find a mix of high quality and scale there.
For sure. But, part of that, I think, is I think it's about empowering the individuals on your team to just kind of spread their wings and fly a little bit. Like, one of the problems I see in content marketing right now is a lot of guardrails, and it's like, it's nice that we have good editorial process and brand guidelines and a content calendar and all these things that kind of keep the content team accountable to the rest of the business. And then at the same time, it's like the nature of content creation is creative, and like you want the people who do it to have their own voice, and I think maybe there's even a little bit of
that's true.
Tension, skepticism around like, should the content just be from the brand, or like, should we elevate the individuals, but I don't think you can have truly opinionated, interesting content unless you remove some of the red tape and just see what people do, see what kind of ideas they really have. I mean, obviously with some oversight, but to try to unlock like a style of content like that.
I agree. I like that, and it makes sense. Ironically, I'm thinking in my head of how you could processize that.
Yeah, well, yes, it's a lot easier.
One every 8 posts, there's one every 8, which is possible. I mean, I'm saying optimistically, you could say, hey, one out of every 8 posts. I'm just making this up. Like, let's take a swing. Like, feel creative to not just find search volume in a Ahrefs tool here, and like do something. Have freedom to fail. Like, working for clients, obviously that's harder to do, but if you built up some muscle, you probably could take a swing once every 8 times.
For sure.
You would think.
For sure. There's a great blog post that I reference often by a guy named Dan Wu. He's a developer and is a blogger as well. And he wrote this article, I think it's called something like Why Most Engineering Blogs Suck, something like that. And basically it's, it's the guardrails, it's the red tape. It's like the engineers actually are open to writing about some of the work they do, but they don't want to deal with getting it approved and having a brief and all this stuff. And the way what he describes in the article is that like a single individual, can generate 10 times more traffic to his own blog than a content team of multiple people with a significant budget, partially because he can just say whatever he feels like saying. And he's a genuine subject matter expert too, but he actually in the post outlines a few examples of engineering blogs which perform really well because they've given the engineers their own place to write. So it's kind of like separate from the proper marketing stuff, and there's no guardrails. They can just go and do their thing. But I wonder if there's a version of that for the content team too, where it's like you can kind of take people on the journey, describe your learnings as they're happening, sort of whatever, throw out your own opinion. But maybe it's the space you give them that is a little bit separate from kind of like the formal marketing.
I like that. I mean, it almost teams nicely with the fact that forums are like communities are becoming more boosted in search. So you could make a performance argument for that as well. If you did like a community area where you feel a little more free roaming, obviously you'd have to nail that positioning. But I like that. Yeah, maybe the content team needs some room to run. Maybe we should create a Siege.
Yeah. Well, for an agency, it could be perfect,
area.
right? Because content marketers talking about content for sure. Sorry, I'm taking you so far off of the
no, I think this is the most interesting conversation. But I think something on that note that people would find interesting as well, maybe we're touching on some of these. Are there any approaches or tactics that you found novel or innovative? Like you touched on one up front, maybe effective for sure there, or that stood out that you might share from those calls or conversations?
From the podcast specifically?
I mean, it doesn't have to be. It could be behind the scenes, whatever you think in those conversations with people running content programs or managing them, that you thought stood out.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, there's, honestly, the biggest thing that comes to mind is every now and then you come across a novel approach to content, but occasionally, you know what I mean? It doesn't happen that often that you're like, dang, this is really cool and interesting. Usually when that happens, it's a lot of creative energy is poured into a new concept. Maybe it's a microsite or a video series or but it's usually different from stuff that happens on the blog. But really the main thing that comes to mind, and this is advice as old as time, is that the companies and the people that stick with it the longest also tend to win at the highest rate. You know what I mean? It's I might talk to a content marketer who's been at a company for 6 months, but the company's been doing content for 8 years and has never stopped. And the strategy has evolved over time, but they've been committed to it and very consistent during the whole period. And those are the people who tell me wow, we get 400,000 page views to the content a month. So my job isn't to create something new. It's to tweak things. You know what I mean? Or it's a person who was the first marketing hire at a SaaS company, and they've been at it even as their role has evolved. They've been very consistent in keeping the content program alive and well during that time. So, we've heard that forever, right? Just keep going, and it probably will eventually work if you're responding to what you're learning along the way.
Yeah, I like that. Just endure. You make me think of the kind of Basecamp 37 Signals guys. I think they had a whole podcast on long-lasting companies. I think about Siege when you say that, and we didn't do SEO for ourselves for 10 years, really. We've just started to do it, and I think some of that is just because we're relatively old now. We've been through it and we published a good amount, but the fact that we published for so long is allowed us to finally kind of break through, which is maybe more novel than it should be.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, I mean, you guys have been at it for 12 years, right? Yeah. I mean, that's a good, that's a great long track record of hit and publish.
Yeah. And I don't think we've done anything mind blowing on the site or anything that just magnetizes links. I mean, a good amount over time, don't get me wrong, but I think it is a lot. It's probably a good percentage endurance. But I mean, I think that ties in a little bit to just the idea of publishing frequency. And you talk to a lot of content marketers that do things well outside of search, and they're balancing kind of that search and non-search in these in-house roles. So what are those kind of thematic lessons or interesting takeaways you've seen around questions on how often people are publishing, kind of tying to this idea of we've been doing it for a while?
Yeah. It's interesting because it sort of happens kind of like along two different axes. One is, what type of business is it? Like, and when I was at Animalz, if we published 2 blog posts a month, great. That's fantastic. You know what I mean? You don't really need that many versus like, I'm trying to think of, we had Lane Scott Jones from Zapier on the podcast. They publish 85 articles a month. And we've had other people who publish 150 articles a month. Like that scale, like, is difficult for me to even comprehend. But in many ways, the business model dictates whether or not volume is going to be helpful to you or not. Like in Zapier's case, it's like they have, 5,000 tools they integrate with and essentially infinite use cases to build automation. So it's like they literally are never going to run out of stuff to write about. So if they have the budget, you might as well just keep going. An agency is sort of an extreme example on the other side, but I don't know, you get a couple good leads out of one blog post, like that could pay the bills for a year, So there's a wide spectrum that I hear about. Probably the other kind of axis that I have noticed from these conversations is, I guess, whether or not the company has figured out what type of content works for them. Like many earlier stage companies are still in this phase of, okay, they like kind of think content is going to work, but they're throwing stuff at the wall a little bit to see what sticks. And then there's a later stage company who, like we had an SMS marketing, Simple Texting, I think was the company. This is like a year ago, so I apologize. My details are fuzzy here. Publishing 100+ articles a month, but like they understood exactly what needed to go on the blog. And they just had this massive list of topics and they're just chip away, But it's gotten to the point because, again, company is much further down or much further along in their life cycle that, everybody's bought in. They have budget to pour into this. They have a way to measure it that probably an earlier stage company doesn't. And so they just go. So yeah, we get like a huge spectrum, but there's also like, sorry, it's a very long answer. There's also like this middle ground of people who I think would really like to publish a whole lot more than they actually do, but they have a very difficult time getting stuff out the door. And there's a lot of, I don't know if you sense it, like get this on the agency side, but I certainly get it on our marketplace. Is like, there's a lot of like hurry up and wait. It's like, oh my gosh, we have so much content need. And then I'm like, great, let's do it. And then I get one brief in 3 months. I'm like, well, where is it? Where is this need? Like, I'm here to help you make it happen. But you hear this on the podcast too, where they don't say it exactly like that, but they're like, oh, we have so much we want to say, so much we want to get out there, but like, it's got to run through this process and the budget has to be allocated and we got to source a writer. And it's like, man, you got to just go, like, just start getting this stuff out there,
Yeah, it's harder than it looks. Yeah. I mean, I see that has been a recent conversation for us. I wonder if there's like some recent theme on that but you'll see, maybe it's leaner teams generally, like a director of marketing might hire us and sometimes be like, we want to publish 10 posts a month to your point, which is relatively high volume. But the director of marketing is hiring us. And do they have a plan for who's going to own the relationship?
Yeah.
Who's going to be like the voice and tone thing? Often we'll have to like almost talk ourselves down a little bit. Like, do you have the process in place? And they'll say they're going to figure it out, but inevitably there's that exact kind of red tape issue, it seems like. And that maybe is a theme. I'm curious if you've seen this at all. It was a theme of the last 2 years, maybe not as big. I think people were just generally more concerned about publishing things like risk. You're like, obviously there's a higher layoff environment in tech for a while there, which has calmed a little bit. I wonder if there's maybe some of that in there.
I'm sure there is. I've definitely noticed that there's just more dependencies. It's like, we will get the content out when this happens or when this other thing happens. And there's, what those dependencies are they vary like crazy. Like sometimes it's budget, which is totally legit. Sometimes it's just like whether the CMO is having a good day or not. Sometimes it's like, a resource is legitimately held up in some kind of like creative process or whatever. But that all seems, I don't know, like the complexity of that does feel different than it did a couple years ago.
Yeah, it's interesting. I do think also beyond the fear, teams have thinned out generally.
Yeah,
So I
that's
think
true.
that's people are doing more with less. So that's probably a lot of things probably happening to kind of contribute to that. Unfortunately.
Yeah, definitely.
So you help scale up content teams often within that what marketplace or whatever you'd like to describe it as. And you've definitely, I'm sure, vetted many freelance writers. What characteristics are you looking for that kind of stand out as like maybe missed or things that you find are like high pattern matching high performance in those evaluations?
Yeah, for sure. Yes, we have reviewed. I say we because there have been so many writers to review that I've had to bring on help to get through them. So, like if we're sourcing a freelance writer for a new project, like it's quite likely we get hundreds of people applying for that, and the vetting piece becomes very difficult. And so we go through like the basic thing of like, did they fill out all the fields in the form? And like I just have to, if they didn't, I have to throw it out. Or like, for example, I always ask when we have a form up for this, like, don't send me a portfolio. Like, please send me 3 URLs live on a website that you wrote or contributed to. And like, give me a sentence or two on what was your role in this? Because you don't know when you're looking at the writing sample, was it someone else's idea and then edited by someone else too? Which is fine. It's just helpful to understand like what that person's role of that, in that project was. It's like, give me a little info on like some of the background here, because I find that to be really helpful. And then when we get into actually reviewing writing samples, there's some subjective things, some objective things. The subjective things I do find myself leaning on a little more. Like, I want an interesting title. I want a good hook. I don't want the article to be too long. There's some things that I know are not in the writer's control, but like if the blog looks terrible, like I struggle with that a little bit when I'm reviewing it, like, are there visuals? I'm kind of looking at all those things. Like I really try to read the piece as an interested reader and like see how it lands. We're actually in the process of rolling out writing tests as part of this too. So like we're going to narrow the pool some and then run people through paid writing tests for customers who like, just like imagine an agency customer, which we do have a couple of those, like they don't want to put an untested writer on a live account. So like we're going to, take an additional step to vet. And then once people are in the door, so anyways, kind of the summary of that is like send great writing samples and give some background, like that's really, really helpful. And then once folks are in, there are a few things that make freelancers great to work with. And honestly, the biggest one is just asking tons of questions. Like if we bring on a freelancer and they get a brief and they write it and deliver it and it misses the mark, that's so frustrating for everybody. You know what I mean? It's frustrating for all three parties, me, the customer, and the writer. And I would so much rather, even if they did it in, 24 hours, got it done super fast. Like I would so much rather it take a little longer, but that writer ask a ton of questions, even stuff about, the content partially, like maybe there's something in a style guide that they're like, okay, how, like, in a practical situation, how do I apply this thing from your style guide in my article? Or, they might say like, is there a feature in your product that you want me to mention in this section? Because this feels like an opportunity where someone is starting to consider a product. Stuff like that. I want the freelancer to like ask tons and tons of questions. And the other thing, this is so simple, but
that's great. Yeah.
When we have freelancers who suggest new article ideas based on stuff they've learned in the creation of a past article, that just like nothing makes me happier. So we've even tested
great upsells.
Totally. Like I want to give you more work. That's how the marketplace works. I want you, the freelancer, to be so busy and getting paid all the time, So like if you're throwing ideas back, I will do my very best to get that stuff approved and I will guarantee it gets assigned to you, like stuff like that. Like the best freelancers are kind of like they're thinking down the road a little bit. They're thinking probably from a slightly wider perspective about that company and their product and things like that. Like all the freelancers we have are great writers. They're reliable. They get stuff on time. It's like that next level is like you're kind of deepening the relationship through, kind of looking out for the company a little bit.
Yeah, makes sense. Yeah, I like all those. You make me think of one thing we do even for in-house writers is like the small detail of like, what does your resume look like? Like we're a design focused writing team, but if your resume just looks kind of wonky, like that's probably not a great sign for like aesthetic taste or like even under feeling out line breaks on a post to your point. Like, does it look strange? That off, like, unfortunately you sometimes got to make it with the volume of applications you can get. Sometimes you got to make some calls on stuff like that.
Totally. Actually, like way back in the day, this is like 2016, back at Animalz, we used to do what we would call visual edits. So like the first, we were writing in Quip back then, which is like a Google Docs alternative. And like the first time an editor would look at the piece, they were supposed to just tell you whether or not it looked like good content, which that was new to me. I thought it was really interesting though. And like at the time it was like, are there bullet points? Are the paragraphs too long? Are there some screenshots with arrows on them? Like, does this look like it's going to thrive out in the wild? And if not, like, let's start thinking about that now, because it's hard to change those things later on. But yeah, you're totally right. Like the way it looks is so important.
Yeah, maybe not a natural skill for many writers. They may be amazing and what's the word? Like proficient at fluffy words and all those things, but they'll write like a nine sentence paragraph or something like that, and not break it up. That's not good content marketing, unfortunately, anymore.
No, totally. And actually, speaking of visual stuff, I think that one of the reasons that we had a lot of success with our content at Animalz is that we had good visuals in almost every piece. And that's another thing I look for when I'm vetting freelancers is, can you draw a little diagram? Like we'll make it look nice later, but like, could you draw a little diagram to help the reader understand what you're explaining? Could be a little chart, a 2x2, an inverse correlation, like even just like a little table that helps sort of organize some things. Like that is just like, when I see that, I'm like, yes, this person gets it. Like they are like the way that they're organizing the information in their head is obvious that they're thinking about how it will be received on the other side. They're not just like getting it all down, they're like taking that extra step to like really make it, like really turn this concept into just like one picture.
Yeah, increasingly today, I mean, it's like words, of course, are still at the core of everything, but it's packaging this concept in the best way it can be packaged. And sometimes that content is just a table, to your point.
Yeah.
And a great content marketer understands that, is not like attached to this idea that they need 4,000 words for some arbitrary reason.
Yeah, totally.
I agree. So this has been great, Jimmy. Yeah, I mean, everyone should go join the Superpath community. Highly recommend it. You're active on LinkedIn. Are you active on X? Where
not as much anymore.
Where should people find it?
Yeah, I used to tweet constantly, and now I've kind of, that's sort of died off a little bit. Yeah, probably LinkedIn is best. Like I post there occasionally, but I'm in the community too. Like I'm posting multiple times a day in the community. So if you want to check out our Slack group, there is a free and a paid component to it. So anybody can come sign up, join it, talk about content. And then if you want more, it's there, but you don't have to. And there's a lot of great stuff there.
Yeah. And we'll link to our podcast, recent podcast together. Yeah. Check out the podcast, subscribe to that. For sure. And hopefully I see some people that are listening to this in the community.
Amazing.
As well.
Amazing.
So thanks for coming on, Jimmy.
Appreciate it, Ross. Good to talk.